You might be painting your Warhammer miniatures wrong. Let's see if that's true. Over the past year and a half, I've really garnered the perspective that I really am just a one-by-one painter. I want to do every miniature I do to completion before I start another thing. But today we're going to test it and see if that's true. Now, up to this point, I haven't really painted a lot of miniatures in one video. And after doing this video, I don't know if I will for quite a while because it took forever. However, I really wanted to put to the test of what is the best way to paint a bunch of miniatures. And this doesn't mean just what is the fastest way to paint a bunch of miniatures, but what is the most efficient and the most effective way to paint a bunch of miniatures for a long amount of time without getting burnt out. So today I'm going to put painting one by one up against batch painting. Now, I feel pretty confident that batch painting will be the more fast and efficient method. However, I also want to test what is the best psychologically fulfilling method, because at this point I feel like one by one to completion is the most fulfilling method for me personally. Having a completed miniature is a pretty big, mental upper for me, and having to spend time across all 5 miniatures and not having any done until all 5 are done, I think potentially could be a demotivator. But that's the point of this video, is to see if that's the case or not. Now, I do feel pretty confident that this is going to be an essential part no matter how you paint your miniatures. Now, that is the usage of a scheme miniature. Now, a scheme miniature is just painting one miniature to completion before you do anything else. And the point of this is to establish your scheme, to establish the painting steps for your miniature. In order to batch paint, you have to pretty well understand all of the necessary steps to complete the paint job. So I feel pretty confident that having a scheme miniature will benefit in utilizing this method to its best method. As well, a scheme mini helps us figure out if this is actually the method we want to go with what we have in our mind or what we've kind of mocked up before with reference photos. So I think a scheme mini also helps make sure that we're not going too far down a path we don't actually want to go down before it's too late. I think another important part about painting large amounts of miniatures at once, or very similar miniatures at once like in a squad, is having very simple and easily recreatable steps. And that was my ultimate goal here. I didn't fiddle around with having different colors and methods for doing all of their little doodads, like the grenades and pouches and all that stuff. I kept the colors pretty uniform across the board. The undersuit was all brown. All of the off leather pieces were going to be German gray. The armor is kind of an olive drab green. And then accent pieces were going to be red. And then the guns were just going to be pure black and gunmetal. I wasn't going to stress about having all the pouches be different colors or any of the little detail pieces be crazy different colors. I wanted the steps to be easy. I didn't want to have to utilize a bunch of different colors at once on my palette because I felt that that would make it inefficient for the batch painting method. So I established all of my base tones, like I said before: brown undersuit, German gray for my leather pieces. And then I did actually airbrush this miniature for the armor for the green, just to kind of make it as efficient as possible. And I did this across both the 1x1s and the batch painted miniatures for consistency's sake. And then any extra like lenses or scopes or anything like that were going to be red. I wanted to have a very high impact, low effort highlight and shading job. So what I did was utilizing contrast paints by doing some recess shading on the armor with Garrigax Sewer contrast paint. It has a semi-translucent, it flows into cracks, and I think works really well for shades. And you can water it down and use it as a normal wash, which I happen to do a lot as well. I use this for gunmetal too a lot, taking some type of black or very dark contrast paint, watering it down and putting it over the metal. It gives it a little bit more of a grittier look and really gets in the recesses and creates that contrast with the true metallic metal. For the German gray and the green armor and the brown undersuit, I kept it pretty standard with some pretty thick, bright highlights on the upward facing portions. Now, for whatever reason, I decided to go with some GW style highlights where I outline the entire part of it on the holster and the pouches and on the gun. I don't really know why I did this. ultimately, I don't think it matters or takes away from the paint job. It's just kind of odd, and it kind of adds time and takes away a little bit from the consistency of the paint job, but it looks good. It's high contrast, stands out well on the tabletop, which is ultimately my goal. So after completing my scheme mini, I felt pretty good about it overall. The only thing I noted was that I wanted to push the highlights brighter, which I did on subsequent miniatures, and I actually went back and did a little bit brighter of a highlight on the scheme miniature later as well. So with the scheme miniature complete, I moved on to paint the other 4 1x1 miniatures. Just felt natural to move on to this point. And I would say it took me about an hour and a half to an hour per miniature, and this was definitely slower compared to the batch painting method spoiler. Now, before I share my thoughts comparing and contrasting both methods, I will talk briefly about batch painting in general. I have never batch painted miniatures before, and is ultimately why I wanted to do this video and try out this method, just to see if I enjoyed it or if it was something for me that I could implement in my painting process. I don't game a lot anymore. I'm more of a painter than a gamer, but I would like to eventually game some, and finding an easy way to complete my tabletop grade miniatures is something I would like to do. The batch painting miniatures took about 4.5 hours to complete, and the 1x1 miniatures took about 6 to 6.5 hours to complete. So batch painting method was ultimately much faster. Now I did take a little bit longer on the scheme mini and the captain, just because I wanted to add a little bit more detail on those guys. So in the future, I probably wouldn't spend that time, but even with that time considered, the batch painting method was much faster. Now, I'm not ultimately surprised by this. I kind of expected the batch painting method to be faster, but I really wanted to explore the psychological factors of painting 1x1 and compared to painting batch painted, which we will talk about next. But if you're looking for pure efficiency, then batch painting is definitely the way to go. Now, I'll be honest with you, I expected to like 1x1 painting more than batch painting, but I'll let you in on something. That wasn't the case. Surprisingly, I actually enjoyed the batch painting method over the 1x1 method, and I think I know why. Going into this, I thought that my motivation was tied to a complete miniature, but after completing this whole exercise, I don't think that's the case. I think my motivation is tied to completing a project. See, in the past, when I'm completing miniatures 1x1 to completion, I'm painting totally different miniatures, and completing each one to completion makes sense for my fulfillment. But when I'm painting 10 of very similar miniatures, getting one done right after the other is a little bit more draining than it is fulfilling, honestly. I found myself by the 4th and 5th 1x1 miniatures kind of over painting these guys and really wanting to paint something different. So that's why painting 1x1 felt bad. But what felt good about batch painting? Well, honestly, I was really surprised by how quickly the miniatures came together with this method. You could easily stop at certain points in the batch painting method and have decent looking miniatures for the tabletop. Now, obviously going all the way through the scheme I created led to better looking miniatures that had some pretty punchy highlights that looked good on the tabletop from far away, but it definitely led to opportunities where you could stop at certain steps if you had to go play in a game night or something. So before I get too much into the weeds here, let me show off the completed miniatures and we can see if there's any difference in detail between the two different methods. Without further ado, let us reveal these bad boys. Alright, so the miniatures look the same. There's not really any difference between the schemes as far as I can tell, and I think that's a good thing, right? So if you're, looking to paint miniatures efficiently for a large army, I think batch painting is a really great way to go. I honestly found that when I was painting a lot of very similar miniatures, that this batch painting method did a lot for my motivation, and painting so many of the same guys one by one after the other was actually more draining than fulfilling. Now, if I had an army that was much more varied between the miniatures and characters, then I think one by one might be better for me because there's so much difference between the miniatures, and then the batch painting method doesn't really serve a purpose in that instance. And with that being said, I do think batch painting requires a little bit of prep work to really make the best use of it. I think a scheme miniature is really important to help establish all of the steps to the painting process. I also think making your paint job easily recreatable is important as well. You don't want to have a lot of variation between miniatures or being focused on a lot of little doodads and fiddly bits that may vary between miniatures, and that will add time and add a lot of paint mixing or paint changing from mini to mini. I was able to just paint brown across all 5 miniatures. I didn't have to change colors a bunch, moving from miniature to miniature. So maybe you're like me, this is the first time you've heard of batch painting, or you haven't tried batch painting yet, or you've been using it forever and you think I'm an idiot. I don't know. But let me know down in the comments what you think about batch painting and what your experiences have been with it, or if you haven't utilized it, what maybe is intriguing about it or maybe not intriguing about it. I'd love to hear what you have to say down in the comments below. If you like this video, maybe check out my slap chop video. I compare a couple different methods of painting against slap chop to kind of figure out what is a good method. So check that video out if you like this one and want to have some other paint methods to check out. Of course, give the video a like, hit subscribe, really helps the channel out. And if you want to see more videos, that's a great way to be notified and stick around. And of course, as always, elevate your game night.